The next part will be, let's put up the polling, and we'll take a vote and see where people are. Whoa.
Ooh, wow.
So, hang on, no, still in flux. And then what will really make the difference is the delta from this morning. And once we get a sense of that, then we'll have Maryzeh come in and comment. So do we have the final from this tabulation? Oh, it's just not on that board.
This is more yes than this morning, I think.
Let's see. And where's Tracy? Tracy, are you, where are you? There you are. Excellent. So our spiritual lead and scorekeeper here. Thank you, Tracy. So just tell us when are these the final numbers? Here we go. So so right now the vote is, are we ready? We've got 68% ready, 32% not ready following the debate. And Tracy, can we put the morning on? Wow. I think we've seen a flip. Okay.
I think we
there you go.
A round of applause.
There. Okay. It is the jacket. So kudos to Mohammed's mother. Okay. There you go. Excellent. So why don't you go ahead there, Maryzeh, take it away from here.
All right. I'm actually going to give really brief comments, given how divisive the post-debate results were. And Tracy, if you don't mind putting up the more recent ones whenever you get a chance. Yeah. Or this is this morning, and this is now. So I think there are a couple of funny things I noticed during the debate that are true in general. So the first thing you should know is that I'm a computer scientist by training. So I went to MIT, and I did a PhD in computer science. But I spent a lot of time in doctors' offices talking to doctors, right? And they are both very cynical and depressing individuals. Just FYI, just some fun facts, guys. So you'll notice the computer scientist, Rich, is trying to convince you that computer science is worse. You'll notice that the person who works in the hospital is trying to convince you that the doctors are worse. This is not novel. This is, my whole PhD was computer scientists saying, oh, we're bad, and doctors saying we're worse. So it's a match made in heaven. So here's my assessment of the situation. So I actually, given that I'm a computer scientist, I fall in line with Rich's thought that these models can be really fragile. And we know that. We know that in many settings that are not healthcare related, right? So you saw examples from vision. There are many examples from natural language processing, from speech recognition. We know that our models tend to be fragile, and this is because models can be built with biases. Data itself can be biased, and then the people who deploy these models also have biases, right? So this is not exclusive to healthcare. This is a machine learning issue. It's a problem with a new field, right? However, I would say healthcare is unique in that it has such great promise. We humans are natural experts in all of these other domains, right? And that's the thing that I think is most striking. Every person who has sight at birth will learn easily what it is to recognize a table. And so we can train machine learning algorithms to recognize tables, but we can also do that. And all of us are natural experts. And the same thing is true for speech. The same thing is true for natural language processing. So in a way, in these other domains, often we're looking at efficiency, automating things for our own convenience. But there are real fundamental questions that Mohammed highlighted at the beginning of his presentation. We don't know what it means to be healthy. We often overtreat patients. We don't understand what the appropriate things to do for people of different backgrounds often are. Should we give women over 50 vasopressors to raise their blood pressure when it's under a certain absolute threshold based on studies from the 50s done on young men? We don't know. Will that affect your physiology later on? We don't know. Can you do a randomized controlled trial on every person with every potential background and every treatment possible? No. That we know for sure. And so I think that there's huge promise for using machine learning in healthcare in a way that there is in other fields. But in this field, we are not natural experts. And so we have an opportunity to use machine learning not just for validation or efficiency, but for discovery. And so with that, I think we're going to take your questions.
So questions? Yes, thank you.
Excellent debate. I really enjoyed the discussion. As a human, we are a collection of our mistakes. And luckily, my mistakes have not been Darwin Award winners, so I'm still here. So what seemed to me to be striking was talking about intuition. So, doctors that have been around a lot, seen a lot, they've kind of developed this instinct or intuition. And what Rich was indicating is that sometimes these machine learning algorithms don't have any intuition. They don't catch those things. So is there a way in the machine learning to build intuition and build that kind of robustness that humans collect?
So I don't know how to define intuition. I mean, if intuition means taking a large number of small and subtle cues and processing them, then I think AI systems probably will have a chance of doing this. And in fact, one of the strengths of AI compared to human expertise is that it's particularly good at taking all of the factors into account. There might be thousands of factors. And whereas I think a human specialist would often sort of quickly zero in on the dozen factors that seem to be most relevant, the AI system will probably take all of the factors into account in some way. So it might actually have a little better intuition than a human would have in some settings. What the AI system sort of lacks is, let's call it robustness, or just general understanding of the way the world works, of the way people works, and the way healthcare works. It really is missing all of that education that we received from kindergarten all the way up through med school. It hasn't learned that kind of thing. And there are some settings where that's very, very important. So, and because of that, it will make mistakes of a kind that the human would not make. For example, and perhaps this is the biggest tragedy, is the model will learn to predict the lowest risk for the patients for which we have the most effective diagnosis and treatments. So it'll actually make the biggest mistake on the patients which we best know how to deal with today in healthcare. And that's really, really unfortunate. And it's something that a human would probably not do. So while I think it is possible, actually, that the AI system might turn out to be better than humans at integrating all of the many sources of information, including, you can imagine, they're getting to the point where the AI system could watch a video of the patient entering the room, sitting, and try to do this sort of, Gestalt assessment of the health of the patient, the way doctors, supposedly are capable of doing. There's a chance that the AI system would even be able to learn to do that. What scares me is, in the early days of AI, we focused a lot on chess playing, theorem proving, and what you might call expert systems. And then we recognized that the hardest part of AI is actually not the expert part of the problem. It's the a human is kind of 100 expert systems plus a monkey. And it turns out the monkey was the harder part of the problem, and that's what we focus mainly on today. And I think there's a similar issue in healthcare, which is that a lot of the expertise actually can be taught to these systems, and they can learn from hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of patients in a way that a physician never could. So they can actually be better at some things, but they still miss the sort of common sense understanding of the world that the monkey has. And there are some times where that's a big thing to be missing. There are other settings where it's not important. So, yeah.
Thanks for the great question. Also a terrific metaphor. I think it's often the tired monkey that makes the mistakes, 2 o'clock in the morning, et cetera, as we heard. So thank you. Very insightful. Any other sort of comments from our panel on that?
Maybe I'll just add, how many people here are clinicians? How many people here have seen a patient with viral infection and just written an antibiotic for them anyway? Okay, you guys are academics, right? That's why. One of the big problems is that clinicians often don't have that much time for patients. And there's a difference between separating the emotion from the intuition and doing things that are, I guess, irrational. And as humans, we are emotional. We do things that are irrational. There's another, on the flip side of things, how many physicians would just love to treat their patient with this drug that just isn't covered by the public drug plan? Right? So you know those rules. Now you can argue that you can put in your algorithm all these rules and such, but sometimes that becomes really, really, really difficult. So I think the algorithms, the machine learning approaches, will learn basically what you give it. And there are a lot of unknowns at times. There's a lot of emotions that are involved that are a lot tougher to get at. And that's where I think we're going to struggle a bit for a while. I'm sure we'll figure it out at some point, but I'm not sure we're quite there yet in terms of replacing that intuition, emotion, all that sort of soft stuff that humans have.
Great, thank you. Next question or comment? Dr. Jaffrey.
My question is for Mohammed. So, I mean, I appreciate the "we're ready" arguments, but if you were to write down a readiness activity, like a sort of like a checklist of "are we ready?" I mean, what does that look like? I'm just curious because I can't believe that everybody is equally ready. So, if you were to rank readiness from organization to organization, or elements of medicine to another element of medicine, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I know the debate's over, but I'd like to kind of get your feel for how do you, what's the way to prepare, even though we're ready, apparently.
Yeah, right. So now that the debate's over, and I think Rich was absolutely fantastic in terms of a lot of the points that he raised. I think the biggest driver for this is culture. I think the technology and data and infrastructure, all the people will talk about that, but I think the number one driver is culture, and I think there's huge variability. There are certain organizations that I know I've chatted with, no way, they're not ready at all. But other organizations that I think are hungry for it but may not have the other stuff. I would say that I think if I had to rank different organizations, of course, it depends on the organizations, but in Toronto, there's quite a bit of variability. I think if we can convince the end users of the big thing, for me, those are the hospital administrators and the clinicians. Because at the end of the day, they're going to be the users, right? And of course, ultimately, it's the patients. Once that community is ready, I think everything else will take off.
I think there are also categories of things that will be easier or harder to use AI for, right? So there are some really low-hanging fruit, right? So there's a reason that all of the big papers that you've seen in machine learning outlets have been focused on medical imaging. It's because you have a lot of them and you have labels. And often you have a gold standard for how to label them. And we're really good in machine learning at downloading really big data sets with a lot of labels and training an objective function and then declaring victory. There is a much harder set of questions, right? How do I account for all of the risk factors in this person's record, all the treatments that they have, and then make a decision about who is at higher risk, right? These are really hard. And so I think that there are categories of things that when other machine learning researchers, I don't know what you tell them, Rich, when other machine learning researchers come up to me and say, oh, I want to work in healthcare, I always say, do you? Finance pays a lot. You seem like a finance kind of. I think that there are a lot of challenges that are inherent in healthcare, but it is very much like high effort for high reward. And so, if you just want to dabble, right? Like if you just need a new domain to publish a new paper in, download an imaging data set, write a paper, and maybe get it published somewhere. But for actual change, it's going to require real knowledge of the data. You need to actually understand the processes that generated the data and care enough about how it's going to be used. You can't just write that, drop it on GitHub and say, the world owns it now. No. You need to be responsible, right? You need to work with a clinician. You need to understand what you're doing. You need to do post hoc checks and say, hey, my model says probability is X at this point. What do you think? And have a doctor say, that's stupid. Why didn't you incorporate this prior? And so I think different things require different amounts of effort, and that's what dictates readiness.
It is amazing. It is amazing how often, after giving a presentation like the one I gave this morning, I get asked by a machine learning person, oh, can I have the data? And it's because they just want to train a model and show that they can get another 0.5% lower error on the test set. And it's kind of like, you've missed the whole point. Yeah. So it's quite a challenge, changing this sort of mindset in the machine learning community. Yeah. And it really does take serious investment to do AI in healthcare and to do it appropriately. Yeah.
Great. Oh, yes. Oh, I'm so sorry. We didn't mean to
One
jump
of the
to you. It's just the lighting. Sorry. Thank you.
One of the themes that I'm hearing is that it's important to choose the right questions when one embarks into AI. So my question is there a danger in over-collecting data? With the assumption that at some point in the future we'll be able to mine the data, so the question being, if there is too much data, we'll be able to address the quality of the data, since that's an important issue.
When you say danger, just like a clarification point, do you mean a danger in how it will be used or in what models will learn?
No, in just having too much information to be able then to verify it, whether for the right question down the road.
I don't think that we ever can have really too much data from a model point of view. I think there are really good techniques for figuring out whether data is appropriate. There's ways to compress, there's ways to reduce, there's ways to select. I think that that's less of a concern than maybe over-collecting on certain populations, right? So often, my favorite example of this is not a healthcare one. So the city of Boston, yay Boston, the city of Boston had an app that they deployed. They said it's too inconvenient to have people call in and tell us that there are potholes in the street. So there's an app that the city is going to deploy. If you enable it on your phone, we have machine learning in there. And so there's this characteristic, you have a phone in your pocket or in the car and it goes doop, doop when you hit a pothole. And so we're going to register that with the accelerometer and just automatically route people to go fix that. And that sounds great, but who has a smartphone and has downloaded an app, and the app is on all the time, so you got a good data plan, and is driving around in their car? Those are really wealthy people. So you're fixing a lot of potholes in really nice neighborhoods. So more data, I don't think, is bad inherently. I think often, because we're humans, the processes that dictate how easily we get a lot more data and on whom that data is collected may mean that we oversample in some populations. And I think that is dangerous, because one of the things machine learning is not good at, if you don't tell it to be good at it, is making sure that your performance is balanced on different populations that you might have undersampled.
Great question. Yeah, Mohammed.
Yeah, that was a fantastic question, and absolutely, completely agree. I think we generally love data, and what's the harm in having more data? I guess the one caveat I'll put in there is that we had to make some decisions when we were dealing with our vendor when we built our infrastructure. And because the problem is there's a lot of costs to collecting data sometimes, right? And when you have to make decisions, I would argue if you had to spend your resources, I would identify the good quality data. Because to me, having less data that's really high quality and reliable is way better than having a lot of data where you're just not sure what the heck it is. So that's that balance that I would advocate for.
Thank you. I think we had a question up here. Thank you.
So I haven't heard a lot about regulation, right? And so the FDA in the U.S. right plays a role here. And so do you think that there is a technical standard that is reachable by a machine learning model where a regulatory industry can understand exactly what its characteristics are and under what situations it will perform and it will not perform? And is that achievable, sort of in the scientific, right, in the scientific side, to give us confidence on the clinical side that these things are doing what they're supposed to do?
I don't know if there is a reasonable standard, and that's because I think that it would require a much longer conversation between these kinds of people, right? Somebody who works in machine learning and has really intimate knowledge of the data. Somebody who works in healthcare also has really intimate knowledge of the data and the processes that generate it, going back and forth and saying, well, what if I could give you this? What would you believe? Well, I think that might be implemented in this way. Would that change the underlying distribution of your model? Right? So I think that there is no easy answer to this. Like it's not, I don't think that we're ready to create regulations around it. I think that needs to happen. But I think that's going to require a really hard set of conversations around, even some of the things that people have been, talking about during, would you be able to accept if an AI made a bad prediction about something some percent of the time? And there was a response that was, would you be able to accept if a doctor was having a bad day some percent of the time, right? We need to have those. Those are not fun conversations, but they need to be had before we can get into the this threshold of accuracy for regulation.
Do you have another comment there, Mohammed? Or, yeah.
Okay.
Or is this you guys dueling again, or you're okay? We're going with Mohammed. Okay.
We're very polite now.
No, it's all friendly, but it's good.
Bruce, would you like to go, or do you have it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's an excellent question, and I know the FDA is looking at this. I don't know that Health Canada is. I probably should know, but I don't. I imagine we're going to get there. I completely agree with Maryzeh. I don't know that we're really ready yet because there's lots of different issues to take into consideration. We're learning a lot just with little things like sensitivity. Is sensitivity sensitivity? Well, there's good sensitivity, and then there's not so good sensitivity. Some clinicians will, again, say, you're capturing all these cases, but I already know about them. You've missed the ones that I really care about, right? So just because you have high sensitivity doesn't mean that you're really performing that well. It's that value to the clinicians. So it's all these little nuanced discussions that have to take place. That being said, in Canada, as you know, I'm familiar with the drug approval process and cost effectiveness. And there's a huge debate around what drugs do we fund and what thresholds do we have. And could you imagine having those arguments around what is a life worth in dollars? Those are really tough arguments. Yet here we are. In most of these HTA bodies, the threshold is between $50,000 to $100,000 dollars per quality adjusted life year. Those are decisions that we go by. Not everyone agrees with them, but that's the standard. I imagine we're going to evolve to something like this. We have to have some standards. I just don't see them happening now. It'll take time.
So I think it's a great question. We're probably not ready for regulation yet, but I would like to see the early systems that are being deployed having to sort of prove themselves more than we're currently asking them to prove themselves. And that would be either some form of intelligibility, perhaps post-fact, for the model, or it would be just some more careful rollout and examination of the kinds of errors that they make in the real world. The other thing, though, is there's lots of different technologies here. There's image recognition. There's predicting what dose you should receive of your current chemotherapy agents. There's diagnosis. There are many different places where we might use AI. Transcribing doctor's notes is a use of AI. And these things all have very different requirements. So it's not the case that there's going to be some sort of single set of machine learning hurdles that if your model gets over this, it's now appropriate for any use in healthcare. It's going to really change and differ dramatically from sub-area to sub-area to sub-area. So it's going to be, it's going to be a little more like engineering processes where Components that goes into planes have to have certain reliability. Components that goes into cars have different reliabilities, even though people's lives are perhaps at stake in both of those settings. We have different regulations for different industries, and I think that'll happen in healthcare as well.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yes, thank you. I think we need a microphone for you, which is on its way. Thanks very much.
Thank you. What do you think the requirement should be for the peer review process, given the need for replicability and verification when often data and source code are not accessible to reviewers?
Source code should always be available to reviewers unless it somehow reveals something about the nature of the data, and there are really good ways of scrubbing that out. I think I understand that there are some reasons why you may not want to publish source code depending on whether you work in a private institution or an academic institution. But I think when it comes, my personal opinion as an academic, right, and so like these two can kill me after the panel. My opinion is that most often I would strongly suggest that source code should be available, right? Data, I think it's a harder question because de-identification gets you only so far, right? We know that most data is re-identifiable. It is, right? Even when you de-ID it, and this is not healthcare data now, right? Like this is just regular data. It is very easy to re-ID a lot of information. But I think source code is something that I always strongly suggest, at least to all of the students I've worked with, you should aim to have it up if there's any possibility of that. I don't know if, again, the two panel members, what do you think?
Maybe we'll start with Rich on this one.
So I definitely agree that if possible, the code should be released. And that's often the case. Now, in a clinical setting, you may not be feasible to release the code, and no one would be able to use it. So that'll make a challenge. Data, I've had papers rejected from machine learning conferences because they said, look, it looks like great work, but this is all done with a data set that you're not allowed to make public. So nobody can replicate your experiments, so why should we trust you? And that's definitely an issue. It's easier to publish in the healthcare community because they understand these kinds of restrictions on data. Yeah, so where to set the bar? Sometimes it's unfortunate that the technical community set the bar at the data really should be freely, publicly available. And that means that there's a couple medical data sets that get pounded on incessantly, and we kind of overfit to them. But definitely at Microsoft, we're trying to make all the code that we develop publicly available to people so that they can use the method, replicate, and most importantly, that they can improve the method, that they can go, by being open source, we actually can create a community where people can improve upon the methods that we've developed so far and take it to the next step.
The only thing I'd like to add is there is this, I guess, a bit of tension in the healthcare community these days, especially among the academic centers, around commercialization. And I get it, we want to commercialize and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, we've made all of our code, it's available publicly, and that's much to the chagrin of some people around us because they're thinking, well, wait, why are you sharing your code? Because anyone can rip it off and take it and commercialize it. I think we have to get over that, personally, because then how are we going to advance the field? There aren't that many people who are doing this stuff well, and I think we should just focus on our strengths. But to your point, we have to get over that mindset, and if we don't, then I see a big threat to exactly what you're saying.
Terrific. I think we have time for one more. Yes, at the back. Oh, you have a microphone. Excellent.
Yeah, it's not really a question. It's rather a comment, but I will still be very interested in your opinion on that. I think the big problem is that for a long time, the whole field of research of AI has been driven by relatively risk-insensitive applications. And as a result of that, the measures that we typically use to assess performance of machine learning algorithms may not be entirely suitable for healthcare. And I think like very important is like, okay, ROC curves and sensitivity, accuracy are nice, but besides of these, we should have methods that assess, for example, where the data generation process has changes compared to one that was used during the learning phase of the algorithm, and therefore how reliable is machine learning prediction with respect to that given case. So I would like to know what you think about this.
There's no doubt that AI machine learning have been essentially research projects for, I guess what's 50, 60 years now. And it's only in the last decade or so that we're starting to see these systems leave the lab and do things in the real world. And all of a sudden, interest in things like fairness, transparency, intelligibility, what's the right loss that we should be using when training the models, what part of the ROC curve should you be worried about as opposed to just the blunt area under the entire curve? All of a sudden, we're worried about all of those things in a way that we were never worried before. And that's because AI is meeting the real world, in some ways for the first time. And all of a sudden, all these real world factors are important to us that we weren't aware of before, or at least didn't feel we had to pay that much attention to before. So it's definitely a real issue. I don't know that there's any general answer to it, because again, every domain is likely to have different needs. So I think what we're going to see is a lot more specialization and diversification in the way that AI machine learning is done as it starts to touch these different communities and get used for different things.
I would say also it's very well established in the epi literature, right? The epidemiological literature, that humans are biased. Doctors are humans, so doctors are also biased, right? So the care that's provided is not provided independent of biases, and these are gender biases, so women are treated a lot less for cardiovascular conditions, even when you say the same things and have the same test results. African Americans get significantly more aggressive end-of-life care in the United States. People with diabetes are treated very differently, even if you have the same weight, same risk factors, depending on race. It's your fault. You're not eating correctly. You need more aggressive interventions. So I mean, I think that, yes, we do need to be very careful about what area of the AUC curve are you optimizing, for what classes of people does this work well. We also are dealing with, imperfect practice, right? There's a lot of medical error kills a lot of people. We give people treatments that they don't need, and sometimes we give them treatments that they shouldn't have. And sometimes we don't know what to do. And so I think that the opportunity for learning, it's very different than in other domains, right? Where again, if, it's very tedious, but if you gave me 1 million sentences, yes, I could label them, right? Like I'm a human, I can label sentences, it sucks, but I can do it. That's not true for a lot of these examples. You give a medical case to 2 different doctors, they might tell you very different things. Well, I think that he's been diabetic for years. Well, no, I think he's just starting to progress. I think he needs metformin. No, I'll put him on insulin. These are experts. I mean, and this is well established. Like specialists will give you very different recommendations. And so I think that part of the opportunity here really is that we can do discovery, right? And that it's possible that we won't just have to deal with human labels, right? Well, I know that this is the right thing to do because all humans know that that's a table. We all know that that's a cow, even though it's on a beach. And yes, there's great danger because, a human, the error is really funny. If a machine learning algorithm can't tell that it's a cow in space, that's kind of cute. But if a machine learning algorithm can't tell that a person needs treatment because they're a different race, and it's learned on models that are based on human data and humans are biased, then that's problematic. But I think that that's why we have opportunity, because there are more problems and we are not experts in this domain.
So I think we'll close the session, hand over to David. But before we just finish, we'd like to thank all of you for your very insightful and relevant questions. And rarely do you see 3 panelists that are so knowledgeable, open with respect to candor and so clear in delivering messages and answering the questions. So thank you very much.